The Swift language comes with many pre-built data types and functions you can use in your own apps to solve a variety of common programming tasks, called the Swift Standard Library. You can think of the Swift Standard Library as a big box of books filled with code that you can use in your own apps. In fact, you've been using many elements from the Swift Standard Library already. The data types int, double, string, and bool are all part of the Swift Standard Library. The print method that you use to print a message to the console is also a part of the Swift Standard Library. When you're developing your own Swift apps, you'll frequently want to use elements in the Swift Standard Library rather than reinventing the wheel. But it's a big library, so how can you know what's available? Luckily, Xcode comes to the rescue with its detailed developer documentation that includes every single class and method that you can use in iOS, including everything in the Swift Standard Library. You've already used the Xcode developer documentation once, back when we researched how to round a double to the nearest integer using double's rounded method. In this exercise, I'll show you how you can use the Xcode developer documentation to take a tour of what's available in the Swift Standard Library. Then, we'll use it how to look up how we can get a random number, which you'll need to generate the random target for the user to aim for in Bullseye. Note that the Swift Standard Library and its documentation may seem a little bit overwhelming at first, and some of the explanations and syntax might not make total sense to you right away. That's okay. For now, the important thing is that you understand that the documentation is there and the general process of using it. If you open up game.swift, you'll see that right now we've hard-coded the random target to 42. And in this episode, what we want to do is convert this from 42 to an actual random number. So how do we do this? Let's check the developer documentation. Just go to Help, Developer Documentation, and minimize some of this stuff. And if you expand Swift instead of Swift UI, you'll see there's a standard library section. And this tells you all kinds of different things you can do with some of the built-in data types like ints, doubles, strings. We've worked with that, all three of those so far. Ints, arrays, and dictionaries, which we'll work with later on. And there's a big section here on the Swift Standard Library that has all kinds of useful information about things you can do with numbers, basic values, strings and texts, collections of data, and so on. So what we want to do is we want to look at int, since we're working with integer numbers here. And we want to just scroll through here and see what kind of things we can do. So it tells us how to convert floating point values. And we actually did that. We used this method here to convert a double into an integer. Also converting strings. And if we scroll down just a little bit, here we see random. And let's click this first one here. And this goes to a detail page that explains how to use this method. If you scroll down, some of these pages actually have example code that shows you how to use them. And it's funny because this is basically exactly what we want. We want a random number between 1 and 100. So what this syntax means, less than 2 and not including 100. So that's what the less than symbol means. So this would actually be giving us a number between 1 and 99. So it's almost what we want. We want between 1 and 100. And if you want 100 to be included, instead of a less than sign, you put another dot there. But we can copy this line of code right here. So right click, click copy, go back here, paste that in. And again, we want the 100 to be possible. So instead of a less than, we're going to put a dot there instead. All right, so let's run it. And hopefully, if we're lucky, we should see something different than 42. There's a chance we could hit 42. It is a random number after all. And now we hit 47. So I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to run it again, and hopefully we'll see something different than 47, and we hit 71. So all right, we're getting random numbers now. Remember that when you're learning iOS development, you don't need to memorize every single thing you can do. Instead, you just need to focus on learning the general concepts and what's possible, and then you can refer to the documentation for when you inevitably forget things. As you progress through our learning path and you'll learn more and more about iOS development and Swift, the documentation will start to make a lot more sense. And you'll eventually get to the point where you can use it to refresh your memory of what you've learned in our courses, or even to start striking off into new things all on your own.